This Saturday is Global Recycling Day, so on agenda this week, Minister for Waste Chris Thomas MHK and Government Waste Guru Stephanie Gray tell us why we should all recycle whenever we can. Some popular myths about recycling are exploded and suggestions are given on how we can all do more to recycle valuable resources. Who ultimately is responsible for waste, and I suppose how does waste fit in with recycling?
Well, the Department of Infrastructure is the policy lead. Aspects of regulation will certainly be with the Department of Environment, Food and Agriculture, and then there are third parties that have a huge role, and amongst those I include all of the local authorities that collect waste, but some private people out there, and by far the largest participant would be the Energy for Waste plant up on Richmond Hill. So it's multifaceted. That's part of the issue. I've seen two waste strategies, the 2012 and the 2018 one, but what I had the privilege to do is in July 2022 we put down a report on where we were with the 2018 waste strategy, and I'm very excited to be supporting Stephanie and others to begin to think about making sure we do this on an evidence-based way, rationally, optimally, given the fact that we need Isle of Man solutions for our own Isle of Man problems, and it might not necessarily be the same as those if we're in Liverpool or in Cumbria.
And Stephanie, I mean, your minister does tend to bang on about evidence-based decision-making as if this is some novel thing, and perhaps it is across government. What have we been doing wrong then in terms of recycling? Have we not followed the evidence?
We've been doing nothing wrong. The science of recycling has become far more sophisticated over the years. Recycling per se, the 3 R's, the Wombles were around in the 1970s. It made sense to recycle your glass bottles, to collect your papers for recycling. So people understood that when you dug a rock out of the ground or you grew a tree, that there was a chemical impact, there was an energy impact into actually converting that into a bottle or a can. And then once you had that, the sensible thing to do was to recycle it. What we didn't have a lot of was the evidence behind why that was a good thing to do. Sustainability has been top of the agenda as long as I've been in the job, and an understanding of what that actually means in terms of waste management is now coming to the fore with the emergence, obviously, of climate change targets and climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. So we have three things which really, I think, drive recycling. We had the legislative aspect in the UK, which came from Europe originally with targets, statutory targets. That was based on a driver to avoid biological waste going to landfill. So Europe is eventually driving, stopping landfill, which we don't have over here anymore. The other driver is sustainability. Once you take rocks out of the ground, they have taken millions of years to make. We brought some samples along today. You cannot replace those if you don't keep them in a recycling loop. That's a closed loop recycling. And the other driver is the climate change, the greenhouse gas emissions, because every time you dig something out, transport it, process it, it uses energy. A lot of the energy, if not most now, is fossil fuel based. And so there is a third driver towards recycling. So how does all that match what we do on the Isle of Man? We have been targeting materials through the Bring Bank scheme since the year 2000, paper, card, grey card, glass and cans, aluminium and steel, things that, apart from the paper that don't burn, sensible, because obviously we have infrastructure which is energy from waste. Don't put things in that don't burn. And the ones to make the decisions about, I guess, are really the likes of plastics and paper. It might be counterintuitive, but they're looking at the carbon emission side, and there's a lot of emerging evidence now done in the UK to support their work on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. It might actually be better to recover energy from that short cycle carbon at the moment, because that's offsetting what is essentially a fossil fuel based electricity production on the Isle of Man, rather than go to the expense of actually recycling it. Have we got the actual evidence for that based on the Isle of Man scenario? No, we haven't, because we don't know what's in the bin. We haven't done the math to see, how far are things travelling, what is the carbon impact. That is, I think, what we need to do. In fact, I'm sure it's what we need to do as an island. We need to take a big step back and a big step up and go strategically as an island that imports packaging in things that we then export for recycling. What is the best thing to do with that material? Is it to send it off for recycling? Is it to compost it? Is it to use it to recover energy?
And of course, Minister, that there's a cost associated with putting things like tins and bottles into a bin, because ultimately those tins and bottles end up at the incinerator, and as Stephanie quite rightly points out, they don't burn, so they end up in the bottom, and then there's a cost for disposal of that, isn't there?
Yeah, no, quite right. So they have to be taken out, and then there's a cost of disposing them if they do accidentally get into the bin and become bottom ash. So in 2029, the end of this 25-year period on our Energy for Waste plant comes to an end, and I want to encourage Stephanie and others to work to sort out what we're going to do after 2029 sooner rather than later. And I really want to take an evidence-based approach rather than merely a policy-based evidence-making approach to this whole issue of what we should recycle, what we should try to encourage reuse, and what we should use to recover energy from. And it might even be that in some cases it's certainly the case that we will still have to dispose of certain things, but I just want to make sure that Tynwald and the public beyond Tynwald come with us as we try to present real evidence, put it on the table so we can make decisions based on evidence rather than just ideology or, make evidence to suit the policy that we start from.
Because, of course, it's very easy, isn't it, for the charge of greenwashing to be levelled at some of the policies that have perhaps been brought into being in the past. I mean, are we doing too much greenwashing? What would specifically you encourage householders to actually do in terms of recycling?
Well, at this stage, we would just encourage them to accept that we need to do the analysis, because that's what evidence-based policy making is all about. And it wouldn't be for an officer to come to a conclusion before they've done that evidence-based. But what I would say is I want to make sure that we wash out of Manx political discourse and public discourse about any aspect of feel-good recycling. It's not about us and us feeling as if we're doing some good. It's actually about how to do things best for our island. The other complexity we have in here is something you hinted at in your first question to me, which is we have so many players. Ironically, there's a perverse incentive for local authorities, to minimise what they take to the Energy for Waste plant, and that can't be good if it's ending up with suboptimal solutions. We need to be a bit more scientific in our pricing policy and in our planning around that. Also, we have private operators and we have public operators, so we've got issues around competition in this whole space that I'm certainly aware to now, and there have even in the past been complaints to the Office of Fair Trading. It's difficult, and what the most important point, as I said, is we haven't got to conclusions as yet. We're to the stage of doing waste audits, and I'm hopeful that the climate change budget will be used to enable us to do a two-season audit to update the data we have from quite some time ago, and that will give us valuable input into the process of working out what it makes sense to recycle and how to recycle. I think also I've heard Stephanie make a really good point about the fact that we do some things really quite well in the island. So reuse, we have some pretty active charity shops, we have some pretty good sheds at the civic amenity sites, not quite as good as it should be in Douglas at the moment, but I know they're building a new premise. And another point to make is that we are a small island with a small number of people in global terms, even in British Islands terms. So when it comes to things like the overall policy on packaging and on plastics, there's not really a lot that we can do. That's going to be determined elsewhere, using derived from EU directives and the overall global policies.
Scotland could argue a similar thing in relation to its size, but it has introduced this sort of deposit on bottles scheme, which is unique in terms of the United Kingdom, at least.
Yeah, and that's that 5 million is a bit different from 84,000, but that's the sort of thing that's a conclusion, and that's exactly what I'm expecting Stephanie and her colleagues to actually come up with, exactly what we should be doing for each product based on all of the issues that she's illuminated for us.
I mean, incentivising public behaviour, whether it's as high up the hierarchy in terms of reduction or at endpoint disposal, is something that we need to be more consistent at. We need to give the same message. We need to keep reiterating that message. We need to explain to people why we are advising certain types of behaviour. As I said, sometimes it could be counterintuitive on the Isle of Man. And that needs to be done as an all-island basis. Scotland is very different. Obviously, the DRS scheme is about incentivising people to take their bottle, get a few points on their card and then recycle that bottle. Is the scheme, are the schemes that we're doing on the Isle of Man not working? Is that communication not working? Do we need to have that incentivisation? The only way we'll find out is if we do the waste audit, know we've got the schemes for recycling and then know they're not working, because that is a massive cost, a massive infrastructure cost, maintenance cost, computer cost, all of those associated management costs that go with the DRS scheme. And we can't buy into the incentives that the producers of those wastes actually will give in the UK in terms of packaging recovery notes, because we're outside that system.
Okay. There are things, though, that we can agree on in relation to recycling. So, I mean, the obvious thing, which I think you've already said, is tins and bottles shouldn't be going into your bin. I think that's one reasonably black and white clear thing, isn't it? Anything that doesn't burn you shouldn't put in an energy from waste plant. That includes bricks and soil and various things like that. I mean, the FW itself is quite unique, as are all island energy from waste plants. In the UK, you would tend to have one large incinerator energy from waste plant with multiple streams, which is purely for household waste. On the Isle of Man, our energy from waste plant is the endpoint disposal for everything that can't go to an inert landfill site or a special waste landfill site. We need to have that facility. We have a lot of expert advisors looking at what's happening around the rest of the world. Are there any alternatives to that, given the admix of waste that we're putting in there? And so certainly, you know, the drivers for endpoint disposal, the first point is if it doesn't burn, don't burn it. And there are things that inevitably are going to end up in the bottom ash. So I remember being quite surprised to learn that glossy magazines have some sort of clay
filler in them, yes.
Which inevitably that clay doesn't burn, so it will end up in the bottom ash. But things like bottles, tins, and as you say, stones, bricks, those sorts of things. I mean, they're pretty obviously not going to burn, and they can reasonably be taken out of the waste stream. We have started recycling our bottom ash now. It is stored temporarily down at the quarry, down at Turkeyland's new quarry, and we've started now campaign working. So every 4 years, specialist equipment comes in and goes through and pulls out what is non-ferrous. The ferrous gets pulled out by the overman magnet, and the secondary and tertiary reprocessing of that. There's a decision to be taken. Should we put in particularly a small wee recycling scheme curbside? Electronic devices are where there is going to be a very large focus going forward. We know that rare earth metals and all of the types of metal that are actually in circuit boards are going to become more valuable as our demand for wee goods increases. We know geopolitically there are issues now in sourcing those, particularly the rare earth metals. China is a major holder for that, so they're going to become more valuable, and therefore potentially the price paid for actually recovering those might get better. So do we actually put in a separate scheme for recycling per household, or do we actually recover it from the bottom ash? And that again is an evidence-based calculation that we need to do. And how much does it currently cost to dispose of bottom ash? In terms of storing it down the energy from waste, that's a contractual price. Right. Okay. I mean, I recall when I was minister, the figures of £500,000 were mentioned, but it's much less than that now. Right. Okay. Yeah.
But that's an important point that we do spend a large amount of money on our energy from waste plants. It's an important part of our budget in the DOI, and that's not the sort of thing we can't discuss today because it's commercial as well. But we need to get to the bottom of this for financial reasons as well as for doing the right thing. It's a good point that Stephanie I've heard her make a few times, which is, batteries and other waste electronic equipment type stuff, stuff, as Stephanie's been calling it, that's not ever so heavy necessarily, but it's got a value that we need to, think about helping the public and local authorities do something better with. And that's, I think, where you're trying to go, which is we need to have a better system in place rather than one based on weight at the incinerator, so that we encourage people. We give people the right message, and then we follow it up, and it's a consistent message throughout the island, such that we put in curbside facilities or something else, so that we can take out batteries and waste electricals. But in summary, being on an island makes everything different because we've got transport in both directions, firstly, and secondly, being outside the UK makes a difference because we're not part of the producer schemes for old cars or for wee goods and the other goods. And those are all the things I want to explore with Stephanie under her leadership in coming months and years with local authorities, because we've got to be in an even better place after 2029 than we are in at the moment.
Because there is as you say, a perverse incentive. Some local authorities or some local authority members see two sides to this coin. On the one hand, it makes sense to reduce the amount of waste we send to the incinerator because that means a lower waste disposal cost.
Yeah.
But then others would argue that if everyone does that, the waste disposal charge will increase because you still need to operate the incinerator. And if we all reduce the amount of waste that we send there, the price per tonne of the waste that does go will have to increase to cover the costs. This whole cost-driven cycle ends up with all sorts of unusual and perhaps not helpful outcomes.
And you can see you're trying quite rightly to extend it into the politics of local authorities and waste collection. The 2 points I would say. Now the majority of revenue that's taken from rateable values is actually taken for water and sewerage. It's not for local authority financing. That's fact. That happened about 8 or 9 years ago. I think I spotted it first and pointed it out to people. And now we're in this really perverse situation where different local authorities are collecting money for waste in different ways. So we have, fixed charges in a lot of local authorities, and then we have paid as part of general rates in other local authorities, and then we have it just paid per rateable value in others. Eventually it's going to become very political because anything that gets more expensive becomes more political, and so we do need to sort it out from that point of view as well. And the issue I hinted at previously in terms of competition was we've got to make sure that ratepayers' money, because in waste it is ratepayers' money. It's not like housing where it's only government's money and rents money. In waste, for waste management, it is ratepayers' money, and we've got to make sure that ratepayers' money isn't being used to subsidise commercial activities of local authorities. That potentially would be problematic given that there are commercial competitors out there. So it's a very complicated issue, and I'm very delighted that we've stepped back and we've written a report on our waste strategy and look forward to involving local authorities in making progress on this over the next months and years.
And is incentivising people financially incentivising people to do the right thing, does this actually really work when you consider that household charges for waste collection and disposal are possibly in the region of £200, maybe slightly more than that a year, and people will be many people will think, actually, if I have to pay £300 to get rid of my waste over the year, that's hardly the end of the world. Trying to incentivise people by saying, yes, but if you recycle really well, you could maybe reduce your cost by 50 quid. And that's not really a strong incentive. Should we actually be looking more at the promotion? Because, of course, that used to be the case. We used to have a strong educational promotion role in government, and that doesn't happen now to any great extent.
I mean, the carrots and the sticks of changing public behaviour is a science in itself. And it's well tried in the UK as well. Many local authorities have tried fines. If you leave the lid of your refuse bin up, you get fined. If you don't put the right things in the right containers, that becomes very adversarial. The drivers for local authorities are mandatory recycling targets set by the UK. Does it work better through communication, through education? I think that's where we have to start. And you're right, we did have a very good scheme that was giving out consistent messages. There's no reason why we can't do that again. Do we need to go down the stick side of things? I would like to hope not. I don't know whether disposal charges per se are an incentive. A lot of the waste charge for local authorities tends to be collection charges as well, which is where potentially there are savings for economies of scale for shared services to be had, and that's a discussion for the Minister to have. But, I'd like to think, let's not go down the stick route, let's go down the explaining to people why, giving them the evidence in a way that they can understand, because it's a very complicated science now behind it, to make sure that we're making the right decisions and we can take people along with us.
Global Recycling Day is the 18th of March. I think what's pretty clear from what we're hearing is we should be encouraging people not to put things that won't burn in their bins, so bottles,
Agreed.
tins, stones, etc. But there's still this ongoing piece of work to do to better understand whether it's a good idea to recycle plastic and paper and different things like this. When are we likely to get some answers to these questions?
We will have answers. I'd say the year after this one, if we do an audit or 2 season analysis, we'll have the answers the year after. Then comes the politics, because it's all to do with how we charge rates and how we set up the market to deal with us outside our message. The other point I would make is that there won't be one answer once for all time. As our electricity becomes generated in a different way, I can imagine the answer changing as well. If we're looking at sustainability, things might become more plentiful with new discoveries, or they might become even more scarce depending on new uses of materials. So it's not a one-off answer for all time set down in tablets of stone. It'll always be. But what I think I heard Stephanie say, and I completely agree with her, I think, which is that it's all going to be about promotion and good communication and clear communication. So this is a great first start for Global Recycling Day. Thanks very much for inviting us for this programme, and it would be great to engage local authorities and beyond them to the public, and also all the commercial and charitable people involved in this sector in a holistic look at these questions, so that we can come to answers that are accepted by everybody, because of the process has been evidence-based and fair when those answers have been arrived at.
And as Minister, you have the ability to effectively create orders and regulations and everything to govern how waste is collected, and potentially that would extend to recycling. Yeah. Is it time, perhaps, because effectively, if every single local authority in the island was to set up its own educational programme for recycling, there could be an awful lot of confusion, particularly bearing in mind what we've said in this programme about the uncertainty as to what the right thing to do necessarily is.
Well, I certainly think the regional organisation of civic community sites is a good basis from which to start in terms of the organisation of all of this. It would be great to have an all-island strategy, policy, implementation plan, which is what we've tried to get. But there's a big mountain in the middle of the Isle of Man, which means there is a difference between the north and the south, and Central Valley's got 2 ends as well. So that's a good basis for it. The legislation around this is in an Act dated 1990, and I think we need to go back and look at some of the definitions in there, which is inside this. We've certainly got we've got money that needs to be spent. So, for instance, this year, one of the few items that Department of Infrastructure got inside the capital programme was a secondary incinerator, and we've also got work on another major waste stream.
And haven't you already got one of those?
You'd explain the news.
The original secondary waste incinerator was developed to take animal waste and clinical waste. That wasn't working very well. Effectively, it was using a lot of oil. So the animal waste processing plant was developed in 2008, which led to an overcapacity secondary waste incinerator, which has had issues about the refractory over a number of years and used quite a bit of oil. So we've now got a work in progress for design a bespoke facility that can take some more special wastes on island as well, which will make us more self-sufficient in terms of how we take things like small labs from schools and so forth. So it's future-proofing the island in terms of clinical waste, category A waste, potential things like bird flu, pandemics and whatever, and it's hopefully going to become far less oil intensive than it will become far less oil intensive than the previous one.
And there are all sorts of waste streams, and we need a strategic needs assessment about how we're going to deal with them. That's basically the main message we've been putting across. So, for instance, on Tuesday, I'll be asked about peel silt, which is ultimately a waste stream. When I went to a very important planning meeting a week or so ago, demolition waste and coal tar from highways is a very important issue that we've got to deal with. So this is incredibly complex, and I'm delighted to be here for half an hour to begin an intensification of the discussion from an evidence-based approach, so we end up with the right infrastructure, the right organisation, but basically the right policy and plan for waste management. Hopefully we've been provocative enough to continue the discussion, and it's going to be very rich, and that's what we both want, because if you're a scientist, you want all the arguments put on the table and the evidence put on the table at the beginning of the discussion rather than once the policy's been made.
Have Minister Chris Thomas and his DOI Waste Chief Stephanie Gray helped your understanding of recycling? Is there too much greenwash and not enough evidence-based decision-making? For now, though, I'm Phil Gorn, Guramaus and Geistyak Rum. Thanks for listening.